Chapter 4. When Saul's son Ishbosheth heard that Abner had died in Hebron, his courage failed him, and all the Israelites were disturbed. There were 2 men in charge of the marauder bands that belonged to the son of Saul. One was named Baanah, and the other Rechab. They were sons of Rimmon, the Beerothite, of the tribe of Benjamin. For Beeroth, too, used to be counted as part of Benjamin. The Beerothites ran away to Gittim, and they are foreign residents there down to this day. Now Saul's son Jonathan had a son whose feet were crippled. He was 5 years old when the report about Saul and Jonathan came from Jezreel, and his nurse picked him up and fled. But as she was fleeing in panic, he fell and was crippled. His name was Mephibosheth. The sons of Rimmon the Beerothite, Rechab and Baanah, went to the house of Ishbosheth during the hot part of the day, as he was taking his midday rest. They went into the house as if they were getting wheat, and they struck him in the abdomen. Then Rechab and his brother Baanah escaped. When they had entered the house, he was lying on his bed in his bedroom, and they struck him and put him to death, after which they cut off his head. Then they took his head and walked all night long on the road to the Arabah. And they brought the head of Ishbosheth to David at Hebron, and said to the king,
"Here is the head of Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, your enemy, who sought your life. This day Jehovah gives to my lord the king revenge on Saul and his descendants."
However, David answered Rechab and his brother Baanah, the sons of Rimmon the Beerothite, and said to them,
"As surely as Jehovah is living, the one who rescued me out of all distress, when someone reported to me, 'Here Saul is dead,' and he thought he was bringing me good news, I took hold of him and killed him in Ziklag. That was the messenger's reward he received from me. How much more so when wicked men have killed a righteous man in his own house, on his bed? Should I not require his blood from your hands and rid the earth of you?"
David then ordered the young men to kill them. They cut off their hands and feet and hung them by the pool in Hebron. But they took the head of Ishbosheth and buried it in the burial place of Abner in Hebron. Chapter 5. In time all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said,
"Look, we are your own bone and flesh. In times past, while Saul was our king, you were the one who was leading Israel on its campaigns. And Jehovah said to you, 'You will shepherd my people Israel, and you will become leader over Israel.'"
So all the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron, and King David made a covenant with them in Hebron before Jehovah. Then they anointed David as king over Israel. David was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned for 40 years. In Hebron he reigned over Judah for 7 years and 6 months, and in Jerusalem he reigned for 33 years over all Israel and Judah. And the king and his men set out for Jerusalem against the Jebusites who were inhabiting the land. They taunted David,
"You will never come in here. Even the blind and the lame will drive you away."
They thought, "David will never get in here." However, David captured the stronghold of Zion, which is now the city of David. So David said on that day,
"Those who attack the Jebusites should go through the water tunnel to strike down both the lame and the blind who are hateful to David."
That is why it is said, "The blind and the lame will never enter the house." Then David took up residence in the stronghold, and it was called the City of David. And David began to build all around, from the mound inward. Thus David became greater and greater, and Jehovah the God of armies was with him. King Hiram of Tyre sent messengers to David, also cedar timbers, woodworkers, and stonemasons for building walls, and they began to build a house for David. And David knew that Jehovah had firmly established him as king over Israel, and had exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people Israel. David took more concubines and wives in Jerusalem after he came from Hebron, and more sons and daughters were born to David. These are the names of those born to him in Jerusalem: Shemua, Shobab, Nathan, Solomon, Ibhar, Elishua, Nepheg, Japhiah, Elishama, Eliada, and Eliphalet. When the Philistines heard that David had been anointed as king over Israel, all the Philistines came up to search for David. When David heard about it, he went down to the stronghold. Then the Philistines came in and spread out in the valley of Rephaim. David inquired of Jehovah, saying,
"Should I go up against the Philistines? Will you give them into my hand?"
At this Jehovah said to David, "Go up, for I will surely give the Philistines into your hand." So David came to Baal-perazim, and David struck them down there. At that he said,
"Jehovah has broken through my enemies before me like a breach made by waters."
That is why he named that place Baal-perazim. The Philistines abandoned their idols there, and David and his men took them away. Later the Philistines came up once again and spread out in the valley of Rephaim. David inquired of Jehovah, but he said, "Do not go directly up. Instead, go around behind them and come against them in front of the beka bushes. And when you hear the sound of marching in the tops of the beka bushes, then act decisively, for Jehovah will have gone out before you to strike down the army of the Philistines." So David did just as Jehovah commanded him, and he struck down the Philistines from Geba all the way to Gezer. Chapter 6. David again gathered all the best troops in Israel, 30,000 men. Then David and all the men with him set out for Baal-e-Judah, to bring up from there the ark of the true God, before which people call on the name of Jehovah of armies, who sits enthroned above the cherubs. However, they placed the ark of the true God on a new wagon to transport it from the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill. And Uzzah and Ahio, the sons of Abinadab, were leading the new wagon. So they transported the ark of the true God from Abinadab's house on the hill, and Ahio was walking ahead of the ark. David and all the house of Israel were celebrating before Jehovah with all sorts of juniper wood instruments, harps, other stringed instruments, tambourines, sistrums, and cymbals. But when they came to the threshing floor of Nacon, Uzzah thrust his hand out to the ark of the true God and grabbed hold of it, for the cattle nearly upset it. At that Jehovah's anger blazed against Uzzah, and the true God struck him down there for his irreverent act, and he died there beside the ark of the true God. But David became angry because Jehovah's wrath had broken through against Uzzah, and that place has been called Perez-Uzzah down to this day. So David became fearful of Jehovah on that day and said,
"How can the ark of Jehovah come to me?"
David was not willing to bring the ark of Jehovah to where he was in the city of David. Instead, David had it taken to the house of Obed-Edom, the Gittite. The ark of Jehovah remained at the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite for 3 months, and Jehovah kept blessing Obed-Edom and all his household. The report was made to King David,
"Jehovah has blessed the house of Obed-Edom and all that belongs to him because of the ark of the true God."
So David went to bring the ark of the true God from the house of Obed-Edom up to the city of David with rejoicing. When the carriers of the ark of Jehovah had marched 6 steps, he sacrificed a bull and a fattened animal. David was dancing around before Jehovah with all his might. All the while David wore a linen ephod. David and all the house of Israel were bringing up the ark of Jehovah with joyful shouting and with the sound of the horn. But when the ark of Jehovah came into the city of David, Saul's daughter Michal looked down through the window and saw King David leaping and dancing around before Jehovah, and she began to despise him in her heart. So they brought the ark of Jehovah in and set it in its place inside the tent that David had pitched for it. Then David offered up burnt offerings and communion sacrifices before Jehovah. When David finished offering up the burnt offerings and the communion sacrifices, he blessed the people in the name of Jehovah of armies. Further, he distributed to all the people, to the whole multitude of Israel, to each man and woman, a ring-shaped loaf of bread, a date cake, and a raisin cake. And then all the people left, each to his own house. When David returned to bless his own household, Saul's daughter Michal came out to meet him. She said,
"How glorious the king of Israel made himself when he uncovered himself today before the eyes of the slave girls of his servants, just as an empty-headed man openly uncovers himself."
At this, David said to Michal,
My celebration was before Jehovah, who chose me rather than your father and all his household, and who appointed me as leader over Jehovah's people Israel. Therefore I will celebrate before Jehovah, and I will humble myself even more than this, and become low even in my own eyes. But by the slave girls whom you mentioned, I will be glorified.
So Saul's daughter Michal had no children down to the day of her death.